Today on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Murdoch wishes for peace and quiet. And we watch what happens when Percy tries out his new whistle. But first, Thomas has a special to collect. Today, on the island of Sodor, we see what happens when Emily collects some new coaches. And we watch Henry wishing he had a more exciting job. But first, Thomas has to collect some special fuel. And it isn't cold. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when there is a best-dressed engine competition. And we watch when Thomas has to do an important job without Annie and Clarabelle. But first, James looks forward to a new coat of paint. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Gordon meets an engine who is faster than he is. And we see Thomas getting into trouble in the snow. But first, Percy hears some worrying news at Tidmouth's sheds. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when James tries to stay clean and shiny. And we watch Emily puffing across the island on a new route. But first, Thomas's friends are planning a wonderful surprise. Today on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Fergus tries to do things right. And we watch Gordon going for a very long slide. But first, Thomas helps Sir Topham Hatt get ready for the harvest fireworks display. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Elizabeth collects some Christmas cakes. And we watch Edward racing across the island. But first, everyone wants to win the prize for the smartest engine. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Percy discovers a track is wobbly. And we find out who will collect the circus from Brendam Docks. But first, Gordon is making some very strange noises. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Henry doesn't feel very well. And we watch when Emily gets to pull the express. But first, Thomas has to collect a very special special. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Skarloey crosses the old iron bridge. And we watch Emily help clear up after a storm. But first, Thomas has to collect something smelly from the seaside. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Rusty races to Duncan's rescue. And we watch Toby find out he's stronger than he thought. But first, there are spooky goings-on at the smelter's yard. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Thomas wants to win a Sports Day medal. And we see Thomas get into a muddle with some chickens, some children, and some sheep. But first, James wishes he had a more important job. Today, on the island of Sodor, we find out what happens when Salty helps to fix the lighthouse lamp. And we watch when Percy's special flies away. But first, Thomas is on a trip to the seaside.